Welcome. You're listening to the ITOT Insider Podcast. And today we're joined by Niki Gonzalez, who works at Wintech. Now, contrary to all those digitalization and IT related guests we had, Niki is really somebody who comes from the SCADA HMA world. So welcome, Niki. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you guys. Thanks for having me.
Nikki's the business director of business development at Wintech USA. She co-founded and co-hosts the podcast The Automation Ladies, and she co-founded OT SCADA CON, a community conference event about industrial automation technology in Houston, Texas. So lots of things to talk about. Niki, why don't you start by introducing yourself and your career?
Sure. Hi, Nikki. Like you guys said. Maybe I will touch on my maiden name, as I started my career in industry about 17 years ago as Nikki Hallgrimsdottir, how I say it in English, Hallgrimsdottir. I'm from Iceland. But I moved to the US in middle school. I took a quick stop in the UK first before moving here. And I've never known what I wanted to do. So I ended up going to college for an international business degree. Having moved a bit and, I've always wanted to travel. I thought I'd like to do something where I get to travel. But I never exactly found, kind of like a dream job for me, or I've never been one of those people that had a very specific plan or path. And so I found myself in the industrial automation industry, actually, after sort of by coincidence. I graduated, got a degree, still didn't know what I wanted to do with it. And unfortunately, there's no starter job for international business degrees. It's, again, one of those like, oh, you know how to do a little bit of this and that, with a little bit of international flair to it. But my dad is an engineer. He's an electrical engineer, focuses on embedded controls. And I worked for him, basically since I was a teenager up until I graduated from college. And at that time, he owned a company that did mobile resource management and tracking for fleets of trucks, boats, vessels. And this was back when, cellular service was 2G and GPRS, and we had to use satellites to make sure to get continuous coverage. We would switch back between GPRS and satellite communication. And I got my start sort of playing every role in a small business. I created technical manuals, I created sales material, I did accounting, I answered the phones, I cleaned the office, I made the coffee. I started to send out and qualify leads. I would send brochures to fleet managers to feed to the sales force. And then eventually I ended up doing some sales. And we had a web-based interface at the time. This was, 20 years ago, which was quite new, to say, oh, it's hosted in the cloud and you can just log on. And I did a live demo over the phone and internet with a customer.
That's dangerous.
Yeah, during that time. And I was able to close the sale, and it sort of changed my view on sales. I thought that sales was something that I would never be interested in. Coming from an engineering standpoint, it didn't seem like a very, I don't know how to put this, like worthwhile career. My dad, coming from the engineering side, didn't necessarily think that salespeople were the best. But what I didn't realize that existed was this world, what we call sales engineering, which is really being more of a translator from requirements to engineering to solution. And I found that in that first sale, I was able to really make this customer happy and solve genuine problems that they had with our solution, tracking their trucks. And that's when I realized that maybe with my business degree, I could do something technical, even if I don't have an engineering degree. And so I looked for technical jobs that didn't require one. So I looked into technical recruiting, technical marketing, and technical sales. And I ended up becoming a machine vision sales engineer for a Japanese company called Keyence, which you may or may not be familiar with. But
not yet.
They sell sensors, machine vision systems, measurement devices. Now they do some PLCs and stuff like that, I think. But they're sort of, one of their hallmarks is that they have an all direct sales force, and they train people directly out of college on their products, on the applications. So I got sort of lucky to be introduced to that world just through the campus kind of recruiting system at my college. And I didn't really know what I was getting into. they had me demo a sensor during one of the interviews, and I just thought it was one of the coolest things ever. It was a high-powered photoelectric sensor that could read through materials like plastic to detect levels or different things. And I just immediately was like, this is so cool. I get to play with this stuff and figure out whether it works or not for something, and then that's how I get to sell it to people.
How didn't you get into an engineering degree? I wonder, like people who are enthusiastic about sensors.
Honestly, I took AP Physics. So the school system is a little bit different here in the US. And that was a challenge for me because my parents didn't know. They had never been through it. They went through, European system. Here it's very different. I took in high school what are considered called AP classes, advanced placement, and you can get college credit for those classes. And so I took AP Physics in high school, and I got enough credits to not ever have to take any more physics unless I got an engineering degree.
So you're so good you don't need to follow anything anymore. It's like it's finished. You learned physics.
Not to say I was so good. I got through it and I got good grades with the help of my dad helping me. But I realized that the English and writing and talking and leading and things like that I could do very easily. The physics and the math I had to work a lot harder for. So maybe it's my inherent laziness, but I decided to go to school for what I thought would be easier. And I saw my dad too at that point. So he was an engineer, an electrical engineer that became a marketing manager and then eventually his own business owner and a CEO. And so by the time I, went to college, I saw my dad as the CEO, not so much as an engineer. And so I'm an introvert by nature. When I first moved here, it was very hard for me to get to speak to people. And I was very shy. But here in America, that doesn't quite, equal success.
Come on, they're so silent and they keep to themselves all the time.
Yeah. Here I was told, very often to smile and be more energetic. And I realized that if I wanted to, kind of fit in here and have what is considered success, then I might, need to kind of get out of my shell. So I forced myself to do things like I took theater class, I took a modeling class, just to try to kind of increase my extrovertedness. And I found that I do enjoy connecting with people. And so I didn't want to have what I thought was kind of a typical engineering job, which is to sit at a desk somewhere quietly and not talk to a lot of people. And I got to see my dad go on business trips and take somebody out to lunch and, that sort of stuff. And I thought, oh, that looks more fun.
I'm also wondering, like, Willem, when you were in high school, was doing a job in OT also in your bucket list? Because it wasn't on mine.
Absolutely. No, I don't think it exists at that moment.
Right.
Yeah. It just happens. Like at a certain point in time, I started in the chemical industry, so also right from university, and I really loved every minute I was there. But I would say until the point I stepped for the first time through the gate, I was going like, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Plus, even in IT, I mean, when I was in high school, I think I would be one of the few people with an email. The internet was completely new. What do you do with this thing? You have a modem, it makes weird noises, and it keeps your phone occupied. So, I mean, IT as a business even didn't exist yet.
But
you're
in any case, so step forward. So today you are at Wintech, so focusing on, if we just name the Purdue model here, if you don't mind, focusing on level 1 to 2 or only 2?
That's a good question, actually. We kind of sit maybe closer to level 2 and then bridge a gap between the levels below and above, right? And the HMI, I think, is kind of been shoved in a corner in our minds as just the operator interface, right? Mm-hmm. You think about, it's where the operators go to press buttons, right? So it's an evolution of the button into a touchscreen.
So for the people who are listening who don't really know what an HMI is, how do you tell them what you're working on?
So HMI stands for human machine interface. It can also be called an operator interface, depends on sort of the application of it. But ultimately, it's going to be a screen somewhere on a line or on a machine, oftentimes on a standalone machine that controls that machine or lets the operator interact with the machine. And I think an underutilized or underappreciated role of the HMI can also be as a controls gateway to a machine, and connecting that machine to the larger plant network. So depending on whether you have a plant that's controlled by, a PLC network or a DCS, a distributor control system, typically anywhere where you have operators interacting with the line or with the machine, you will have an HMI of some sort. And the HMI of today, the sort of standard, is a touchscreen interface that is programmable. It's programmed typically by the machine builder, whoever initially built that machine or the line. In some cases, again, depending on the type of plant, it also may be programmed by plant personnel. But typically, it's just kind of a standard interface that comes with a piece of equipment. And it will have multiple screens on it in some cases, buttons that show the operator or give the operator the options to turn things on and off, make selections, but it'll also show alarms. But its primary role is typically, again, for the operator to interact with the machine and the machine to display or give information back to the operator about the status of the machine or what it's doing. But those are really just the basic functions of an HMI. And again, that's kind of just replaces buttons with a screen. But the HMI does have and can have a lot of functionality that, does a lot more than that. I would say it's kind of also the gateway between like the operator, the machine, and then the greater plant network.
Okay. Do you guys also work on SCADA because you organize a SCADA conference?
So slightly misleading name. But the way that Allie puts it, and Alicia Gilpin is my partner in my podcast, Automation Ladies. And this was really her brainchild, this conference, which is kind of a mix of a technical training. She calls it automation speed dating because they're very short, 30-minute sessions focused on different topics of OT or industrial automation. The name came from the way she sees it is like the movie Lion King, when Mufasa describes that everything that the sun touches is your kingdom, Simba. Everything that is under SCADA, like everything that falls under the supervisory control and data acquisition system, is our domain, is our OT Industry 3 devices, PLCs, field device, things that control and make the plant move, and things that make things go and not go. Right? That's kind of how we see what subject matter OT SCADA CON focuses on. So it's actually less about SCADA and more about everything that's underneath SCADA. But we do talk about SCADA as well. And that's kind of as far as we go. We have one 30-minute session that we call Industry 4.0.
It's refreshing, Nikki, that you have a 30-minute focus on Industry 4.0 and a 2 or 3 day focused on Industry 3.0.
Yeah. So we have, I think, 20. I'll have to check the schedule for this year, exactly the number of sessions that we have, but I think that they're around 23, 24. And yes, one of them is Industry 4. One of them is like trending graphs and SCADA screens. So there's one SCADA related, maybe two. So there will be topics, starts kind of from the basics, from PLC and field devices. We have a section on VFDs. We have a section on motors. We have a section on HMIs and remote access. We've got sessions on different industries. So kind of best practices, where things are at, what people like to see in agriculture and oil and gas. There's process instrumentation, safety, both machine safety and process safety. But we really look at kind of what are the primary things that a lot of our community is smaller, independent systems integrators that have either worked at plants or worked for large integrators, and they're frustrated that they are hampered by something. They're really kind of doers and people that like to get their hands dirty and just get stuff done. And so they end up kind of freeing themselves of those constraints, for better or worse, and going into business for themselves because they want to get more done or be able to, be flexible for their customers, work on different types of stuff. A lot of us, I think, are maybe neurodivergent a little bit. So on the autism spectrum or have ADHD, we kind of fall in love with this control stuff, but also for the reason that it's constantly challenging and it's constantly different. And I think most of us in the OT SCADA CON community would have a really hard time being in IT, for instance, because there's maybe, I can't speak to it. I've never worked in IT, but like the constant firefighting and being the one that's like sitting on a bucket at 3 a.m. and the whole plant's like, down and they're depending on you to get something back up and running. That sort of stuff is kind of what drives a lot of these people. And
we never have in IT any urgent incidents that require.
Oh, I know, right? Like,
no, actually, we would like to have less firefighting.
Although,
but yeah, they find that there's a lot of rhetoric in the industry about what people should be doing and what the future looks like. But then when they go to these plants every day to service and or upgrade or, do what they do, which is usually smaller projects, that stuff doesn't mean a whole lot to them because they still have to upgrade this panel that has no drawings or, program a PLC who the program was developed by someone 30 years ago in ladder logic and it wasn't well documented. It's more of the reality of kind of like the ground situation in manufacturing that isn't where it should be today.
But it is very interesting and also I would even say necessary that we touch this topic because obviously we are called the ITOT Insider. So yes, obviously we talk more about data and the cool and I would say the cool AI stuff, etc.
Yep.
But one of the things I come across every single day is a lack of a decent foundation. And there is no AI and there is no BI reports. And if your sensor is faulty, then the data is faulty. Full stop.
Yep.
And it might be a bit, I would say, it's a pity that there is this industry 3.0 and then you have industry 4.0, and then because probably people needed a new concept, we started talking about industry 5.0 because we forgot the human in industry 4.0. So why don't we go for the 5.0 thing and now we reintroduce the operator? But it's like it's fugazi, it's clouds, it's so can we go back to the foundational work? So if you, with your experience with the customers you're working with, like what is the state of the industry from your perspective? Where are we at?
So it's definitely, it depends on what markets you look at, but the majority of manufacturing here in the United States is small businesses. So yes, we have very many large conglomerates that make consumer goods or that make, energy or whatever that operate a number of plants, and they have these initiatives and they've had these initiatives in the works and they may be mature already with a close to lights out or very efficient, digitally transformed operation across all of their plants. Those absolutely exist. But the majority of manufacturers here in the US are small, 10 to 50 people. And they really don't have that level of digital maturity. Some of them have gotten over the years to, they have a plant level SCADA, for instance, right? So SCADA stands for supervisory control and data acquisition. It almost seems like an outdated term at this point. And I know there's been a lot of rhetoric that like, SCADA is going to die because we have so many other ways that we can visualize data and work with data, and this old kind of model of the, going from one level to the next, especially when it comes to things like the UNS, for instance, unified namespace, trying to have one source of truth that multiple systems can draw from and bring context back and forth rather than kind of one feeding the next. I'd say we're still very much at this level of these manufacturers have been buying equipment from vendors that typically have closed ecosystems. But at the same time, they may have we're a plant that runs on this, right? Less common here in the US to be Siemens, for instance. We're more likely to be a Rockwell sort of house, or ignition SCADA is also really popular here and is a little bit more open. There's Aviva. I mean, there's a number of these like SCADA companies that have been around for a long time, and of course they're innovating, so they're creating newer systems, newer ways of doing things. But what we have here is really a lot of plants that have been able to make some investments over time, but they are typically mixtures of equipment that has been around for 10, 20, 30 years. And they typically will have a mixture of hardware vendors that come in on those machines. Because unless you're a very big player, you're not going to be able to specify what PLC you want on a machine that you buy.
No.
What sort of communication protocols you're going to have on a line or a skid, or some sort of piece of equipment that you didn't build yourself. And so you end up with these plants that typically have a mixture of different equipment that speak different languages, that in some cases have been brought up into a larger SCADA system. And in other cases, you have kind of a mixture, a hodgepodge, right? Some things may be very clear to access in the SCADA, and other things may be still completely disconnected. And we still have manufacturers that operate off of the air gap principle, right? If I don't connect it, it's going to be safe.
There's something to say for that.
Yeah. And
you don't need to pay a cybersecurity expert.
Yeah. And that is a huge, problem right now in the US. We're a big target. I'm sure just as Europe is, right? You have low resource actors that are becoming more and more powerful with AI and things like that. And they don't have a whole lot to lose. And they want to ransom or whatever, our companies here in the US, which are considered high value targets. And so right now, it's a really rough time to be a small manufacturer, I think, in the US, because margins are typically thin. The way that CapEx and budgets have been run at these companies for many, many years now is we can justify a big CapEx project with a payback period of X, Y, Z, but there's not a lot of budgeting for ongoing maintenance and upgrades to that equipment. And so we have a lot of equipment that's coming close to end of life, that has components that are already discontinued. There's a lot of this. Well, it works. Don't break it. Don't touch it. Don't upgrade it because it's running, right? And that's a mixture of downtime is very expensive. Downtime is typically not budgeted for very well. And when these companies are running like that, you tend to have unexpected downtime events happen regularly enough that it eats up budgets that would otherwise maybe be used for transformation. So it's really important, I think, to be able to work with those types of manufacturers and help them piece by piece, get to where they need to go, versus trying to, get them to wholesale make some big upgrade to their plant. And again, it very much depends on what side of manufacturing you look at. The long tail of the majority of companies, or the big Fortune 500s, right? They're going to have obviously a very different set of, or very different ways of doing things. These smaller manufacturers also typically don't have very mature IT departments.
Yeah.
Well, they're small. I mean, even big companies only can have that much IT. I mean, they're not Google or Amazon.
Like me, John, the everything IT guy who...
You also have everything engineers in IT.
Yeah.
Nikki, from your perspective, you mentioned transformation. What does transformation look like for that long tail? Because we hear about those big companies and cloud platforms and everything, but what would that mean for a small company with a couple of machines?
I think honestly, what does it mean for them? I mean, it means the ability.
Is it relevant even?
It means the ability to stay competitive and to stay in business, I think, ultimately. Whether it's next year or probably in the next 5 years, we are making a push to reshore manufacturing back to the US. But we have a huge problem with workforce. We don't have enough people that want to work manufacturing jobs. So a traditional manufacturer that operates most machines independently with manual labor, those jobs are not attractive to the current generation. They can make videos on TikTok and probably make more money. there's not a lot of creativity or, it's not super pleasant. And younger kids too, like having a specific shift where I have to go and I can't have my phone and I need to wear safety devices and it might be loud. That's not very attractive as a job. And those jobs by nature can't pay a whole lot because those manufacturers don't have a ton of margins. They're not looking to, pay top dollar for somebody to push a button repetitively throughout the day. So it's a really big challenge, I think, for the manufacturers here. If they don't transform some of their operations, they're going to continue to have really high turnover and they're going to have a hard time getting employees to work there. And so I think it's a survival necessity at this point to embark on these if they're not already, so that they can be more competitive in their throughput, in the quality of the products that they make, in their cost of running the plant due to unplanned downtime. But then a huge part of it is that they just can't get people to operate these machines.
Yeah, it's maybe funny that, because you're right. When people talk about digital projects, it's typically the big ones who showcase something, and even then, it's like they showcase just something. It's like people then go like, oh yeah, company such and such, they are doing crazy stuff. No, they ran a pilot.
Yeah. Or like one department, they did
Yeah.
something with one process and they were able to get these crazy results. And then like the rest of the plant, knows nothing about it. Right?
And it's even, I had conversations with small manufacturers where they go like, yeah, David, but we'll never be able to catch up with company X, Y, or Z. And then I go like, yeah, but you're not that different after all.
I think the advantage of a smaller company is, I work in a bigger company. It takes a lot of talking, a lot of politics, a lot of getting everybody aligned on something, talking about the budget of I don't know what year. There's a lot of overhead in a big company before you get something done. Sure, you can get a bigger budget, but you also are wasting a lot of budget, you could say, just to get everybody aligned. I think there's differences between companies. But in a small company, I don't know, I worked in smaller companies too. You say, hey, I think it's a good idea. Okay, do it.
Yeah. I'm a fan of that.
You can be super fast.
Yeah. I work with WinTech now. We are about 20 people here in the US.
Okay.
And I work directly for the CEO. And one of the things that I've learned that I appreciate and is a good place for me is where I can take what I would consider to be smaller steps with a larger goal in mind, right? But where that individual step or Lego block or however you want to put it, right, plays a part in a larger system, but you don't need to get to the end to realize value. Each sort of step in and of itself should have a value associated with it, so that if you get stuck or you need to reverse course or you need to pivot a little bit, you haven't gone down the road of a whole lot of development and things that then are now not useful at all. And I know I can be long-winded, so I didn't get to, kind of like the middle from my early career until now. But I worked for another company from Germany called Festo, which you may have heard of.
Oh, yeah,
They're big
of course.
in motion, mechatronics, pneumatics. And then I worked for another German company, a software company, where we did simulation. So electromagnetic simulation, simulating prototypes before they're physically manufactured to see how they will behave electrically, to optimize their design for manufacturability, for cost, for performance, and also make sure they meet regulatory requirements before you manufacture the full prototype. And then from there, I actually went into enterprise AI back in 2014, 15, 16, when it was a lot newer, less mature. And I joined that company to kind of bring it to industrial companies, because I know it's a struggle. It's a challenge, right? Not only do you have to have clean sources of data, but then how do you take them to that BI layer and then get some AI suggestions and, that sort of thing, right? And back then, and even now, it's still kind of in the enterprise layer that makes sense, right? Enterprise companies have the money to invest in this sort of thing. And it's usually not a plug and play I think we're probably at some solutions now in our industry that are meant to be a lot easier, and maybe they can be done like without managed services and things like that. But back then it was much more like, yeah, we would do a pilot, we would build a thing, it would be very custom, it would be supported by our engineers, it would be supported. So we used to do using machine learning in forecasting for supply chains, predicting demand for products that have never been released by predicting demand reviews, other things for similar products, taking, weather data and popular just sentiment from the internet, all kinds of things like that. But back then we did we worked with big companies that would say, oh yes, we need to do, business intelligence, and we want more AI in our business intelligence, and we want to be able to make more accurate forecasts and predictions and things like that. But we're in the middle of a 10-year, digital transformation project, changing our ERP system. And, it was supposed to be done 5 years ago, and it's now 5 years over budget, and, I don't know how many millions of dollars over budget. And, we're going to get to this AI stuff as soon as we're done with that. And our philosophy at our company, Algo, that I worked for at the time, was, no, let's just take small steps. And, let's look at your maturity where you are. And there's always a step up from where you are, right? It's not you have to go from here to here. And a lot of companies were kind of like that. They're like, well, we're doing the ERP now, and that'll get us from here to here. And then we'll go from here to here.
Yeah.
And that I saw over the 3 years that I was doing that, as just those ERP implementations were generally not very successful. And they were usually being run kind of outside of the people that were actually going to be using the damn thing. And they didn't really have input into how it was going to work. And maybe the new workflow was not as good for them as the old one was. And so people would bypass it. Or they would just continually wait for this giant digital transformation to be done in order to take any other steps. And I always just thought, like, looking at that, that there's got to be a better way to do it. So what we started doing is kind of consulting, and we would go in oftentimes with this meeting of like, yeah, we want AI. And then we'd look under the hood and say where you are. And we say, actually, let's start by getting your data organized and off of these Excels and into, something where we can start to run some models. But you don't go from here to here all in one project, and you shouldn't, right? You should have some manageable steps that you can prove out and work with your people at the next step before you go, all the way up the stack. And that's kind of how I look at this stuff from, now that I'm kind of back in the manufacturing as well. And I personally don't love all these big buzzwords because I think too many vendors take them and use them in marketing material and make them irrelevant, because they're kind of not saying anything of substance. But to me, there is a whole huge opportunity. It's not as sexy. It's not as fun. It's not as easy to sell a lot of small things to a lot of small companies than it is to do a one big giant, cool POC with a brand name that everybody recognizes. So it's the slog down at the bottom end of things, to help these manufacturers kind of upgrade one thing at a time and come up with a strategy that's not, going from 0 to 100, but, to go from 0 to 10 and 10 to 20 and 20 to 30, that sort of thing.
This reminds me, ERP migrations running over time is like, I think it's almost by definition, but I was visiting a customer. They had huge high voltage air compressors, but really like directly linked to the high voltage net. And they were just all running at 100% capacity. And I went like, dude, this has to cost you a gigantic amount of money every year. So I actually proposed a very simple control mechanism to control these high voltage compressors. But yeah, they were running an ERP migration project.
Yeah, and they were too busy with that to focus on any of these other small things that really would have produced gigantic savings or gains, right? And a lot of these companies, they're not looking at their energy usage. I mean, there's so many what you would consider to be low-hanging fruit to an outsider. But But when you're not used to being in that plant environment and understanding how the budgets are allocated and who gets attention for what, there's a lot of underserved people, stakeholders, departments. And it can be, if it's a boardroom situation, then of course it's a lot more shiny to say we have a new digital transformation project that's going to give us outsized gains and huge transformation than to say, oh, I'm going to, put a little control system on some air compressors.
Yeah, that it is. Hey, there is one last thing I really want to ask you, is how does someone start organizing a conference? That has to be a lot of work.
Yes. You need somebody like Allie, my partner, who thinks of things and then decides to do them and puts them out in the world, and then somebody has to pick up the ball and keep it rolling, and that's me in this case. We did kind of the opposite with the podcast. I proposed the podcast, and I was like, oh, I just need you to come on it, and you're going to have to do nothing, which turned out to be completely not true. But it took her kind of pushing things along for it to really materialize. So I think we found a really good partnership in each other. She's an engineer by trade. She's a chemical engineer that went into controls. She has an insatiable curiosity like I do, but we come at it kind of from different sides of the industry, different worlds. She is not as much of a people person as I am. So we have that dynamic of like, she can just be quiet and let me talk if she doesn't feel like talking that day. So it works out for the both of us. But she came up with this concept. She came up with the list of topics that she wanted to teach. And then she was like, we're going to do this. And then I was like, oh, how? And she's like, well, I don't know. We'll figure that part out. I'm like, okay, well, let me figure that part out.
That's your job, Nikki.
Yeah. And so I think part of it is being naive and being okay with diving into it before we look into it too much, because once you do look into it too much, you realize how much work it is. You go, this is crazy. We should never do this. And yeah, that's kind of our MO with a lot of things. We jump and then we figure out how to build the plane on the way down.
I think that's a perfect way for another fun episode of the ITOT Insider to wrap this one up. So OT SCADA CON takes place this year, July 23 to 25. Are there still tickets available?
Yes, I think we have about 20 tickets still available.
All right, that's not too much. So ones who are listening, buy today. And the Automations Ladies podcast can be found on all major channels or via automationladies.io. Nikki, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in again. Make sure to subscribe via itotinsider.com. And until we meet again, bye-bye.